All right, so this week, not quite as much going on. Start your testing for Harmony so that we are ready for an exam next week and your Harmony paper the week after. I will make sure to have a study guide to you by Friday. Any questions on schedule? All right. Last time we were talking about levels of viability. Yeah, question.
And we're doing some play testing next week, so we should probably have some stuff balanced by this weekend.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah, starting as early as Monday, I could see us beginning to do some play testing in class with some decks that you have balanced. So try to do some balancing work and make sure that you're at that stage by the end of the weekend. That'll be good anyway, because you can't start writing your paper until you collect data. You can't collect data until you've made the balance changes. You can't make the balance changes until you calculate the appropriate balance changes and really think about the playability of those balance changes. So there's a long process to follow through to be able to submit a paper. So I'm going to try to build that into the structure of the class where I can. Yeah, levels of viability. We talked about an optimal or a min-maxed character having the best possible mathematical performance based on some evaluation procedure. You can min-max something with respect to a variable or with proportion to a variable. So maybe you want the highest damage build regardless of defense, the most defensive build regardless of damage, the best linear combination of damage and defense where you're weighting damage at 60% and defense at 40%. You can min-max according to any combination of variables, but the idea being that if you have done that process, then you have gone through an optimal building process. Then we have the concept of a viable build, one that is not mathematically perfect, but can beat the game on a default difficulty by a typical player. Whereas marginally viable, that it can be beaten, the game can be beaten, but you need someone who is very skilled with the game in order to do that with that build. And there was non-viable, where an expert cannot beat the game with that build. So questions to ask as you're thinking about designing systems where the end result is build viability. So what is the difference in power level between something that is optimal and viable? Think of trying to design for optimal being someone who has put hundreds or thousands of hours into a game to completely understand its process and then posting the results of that somewhere on the internet. You can try to target viable being, this is according to someone with a reasonable amount of intelligence playing the game, making some decisions. What does their build look like? This is not someone who has looked up guides on the internet about how to optimize their character. This is someone who just opened the game, is playing the game with the in-game tools that are available and making decisions based on what they think is going to be good. That level of interaction with the game should produce a build that is viable. That is going to be the majority of your players, so you should absolutely target the game systems toward that. It's very frustrating when I play a game blind and don't end up with a viable build because of some miscommunication between what I thought was going to be good and the game's communication with me about what is good or what I should do. You should also ask yourself, how easy is it to make a non-viable build? What combinations of your game systems, when put together, create something that is non-viable? What proportion of your player base is going to be thinking along those lines? Maybe someone tries to play the game and role play in a very particular way. Maybe they're trying to create the character SpongeBob. Who knows? But if they're trying to do that, how easy is it to create a non-viable build? Do they have to make silly decisions, or are there reasonable decisions that people could make that could end up with something that is non-viable? Biggest hole I can poke in Path of Exile is it's way too easy to make a non-viable build. So anyone who's hit a wall will have to restart the entire game, depending on how much respecing is allowed, how many character decisions are allowed to be changed. So if you're making permanent build-defining decisions, make sure that every path through the game provides something that is viable, or it's very telegraphed when something is non-viable, or build systems that allow players to make different changes to their builds in the middle of the game. They can recognize something is not viable, and with the information they have about the game from that point, make an intelligent decision about how to change up their character. Any questions on designing for viability? It's just something to very much take into consideration because it is a big frustration point in a lot of games, and it's really hard to get right. For character progression, you can even think about just after character creation. There's already some differences between a viable character and an optimal character. How could you optimize the character creation process, or the initial stats that you're allowed, or the initial equipment that you're allowed within the character creation process? The goal should be to make this as minimal as possible. Usually, that, however that is, they haven't already made decisions that are going to hamper them for the rest of the game. But as the game progresses, it becomes more and more noticeable as there is divergence between a viable build and an optimal build. So, as a designer, you could design for viable builds. And if you spend your energy and effort designing, assuming that your player base is designing viable builds, the game is trivial for optimal builds, and your expert players will complain that the game is too easy. You can think of it in terms of if your game has gained traction because streamers play your game and want to show their expertise to other players, then if the game is trivial for them, they can't make revenue. There's nothing interesting for them to do. There are no interesting decisions for their optimal build because the game is trivial. So your streaming audience will not be playing your game. So things like you can shred the final boss. Then your narrative is building up to this very large scale encounter that is supposed to feel really epic, and then this optimal build just destroys the final boss. Why did we have all of this buildup? Couldn't half the game ago, when my optimal build was still capable of defeating the final boss, couldn't I have done this then? Why did the story script me losing to that boss at that point? That feels weird and wrong. So there can be narrative inconsistency that players feel like the game balance broke the fourth wall. So if you don't want to design for viable builds, you could design for optimal builds. If you do that, the game is too hard for most players who are playing it. And if you've designed 100 game objects with regards to the game, then only a few of them are going to be viable. Some decisions are very right, some decisions are very wrong. And players don't like doing that or feeling like they have to look up a build guide in order to create a character that can beat the game. So it's especially a big problem if your game has some content at the end of the game that is meant to keep players playing the game for a period of time. If players can't get to that end game content because their build isn't good enough, you're going to have retention issues. Some of the most vocal members of your community will be streamers. So if you collect data only from the streaming audience or the expert players, you will start listening to your expert players at the detriment of your average player. This can become especially important as the streamers gain traction and popularity, and so their voice carries more weight in the players' community. Just be sure that you are taking into account those who aren't being quite as loud about what they want from your game. So streamers are not the average game player. They have more time. They're doing this for a living for the most part, and they have more time to play games. They have had more experience to get better at games in general, and they've engaged with your game at a higher level. They have more knowledge about your game, more experience with your game. They're a different audience. So games that I have found are successful with this target both of these, but in very different ways. You can have a ranked mode and a story mode. You can have something that targets the top competitive players and something that targets the average player. If you can break your game into different ways of targeting those two audiences, then people have something to get out of your game regardless. Yeah.
Thinking that it makes more sense for a single player game to optimize for reliability.
Yeah.
And for a multiplayer game to optimize for builds.
Yeah. If it's multiplayer, how easy do you want it to be to onboard new players? How easy do you want it to, especially if it's competitive? Do you want to have something that is ranked where new players are matched against new players and that's how they learn how to play the game, and eventually that becomes something that you're playing experts against experts. Streamers are playing against streamers, but not against players who are new to the game. There are lots of ways around that. But yeah, absolutely. That in general, single player games want to target viability, and multiplayer games, you need some way to target different audiences.
I feel like skill, like how big of a variable skill is also has an effect on this, because like
Yeah.
this brings up to mind like Elden Ring, where most of the community believes in those viable builds, but the community also designs for optimal builds. Whereas like because skill is such a big factor, it's like really most people who really like that game actually discourage you from trying an optimal build, because they're like, it's just like it makes the game too easy. The point is that it's hard. But and also be careful collecting data from streamers. When Elden Ring released their DLC, and streamers were playing the final boss, and these were players with, you know, thousands and thousands of hours in the game, and they couldn't beat it. They knew it was time to dial it back a little bit.
Yeah. Sometimes it is worth listening to your streamers, but yeah, when things are too difficult for streamers, you know you've made a mistake. So in general, you'll find that balancing your game for most players and balancing your game for experts end up being at odds with each other. They end up pulling you in two different directions, which sometimes there is a meta mechanic that you can make that does separate these two audiences in ways that you can balance for both. But if you're trying to have the same game be accessible to two different audiences, you'll find yourself trying to play the middle ground in some capacity, and there's no way to win with both of those audiences unless you can target them separately. So some solutions: difficulty levels. This is where you can allow for various difficulty levels. The streamers will be playing the game on the hardest modes. Your average players will be playing the game on lower difficulty levels, and that's absolutely okay. In a multiplayer game, you can add drop rates, or you can modify drop rates between difficulty levels to give players a reason to play at the highest difficulty that they can get away with, to challenge them, to make them better at the game. But that's not locking anyone out of the game at the lower difficulty level. It just applies some passive pressure to play at the highest difficulty that you can. But it's not really as possible with too many live service games for that reason. But you still can do that and change drop rates in live service games. You can market your game to a certain type of gamer. If you market your type of game to a casual player, there are too many active streamers, I don't think, that are playing a lot of farming types of games. That's more of a casual genre in general, and if you're a streamer, you're probably playing something that is a better showcase of your gaming skill. There certainly are, but I would just think in comparison, there are probably fewer streaming that. But that's targeting more the parent after work. It's had a long day, needs to relax. So make sure that you market your game for the type of audience you plan to balance it for. You can balance to reduce the difference between viable and optimal builds, where it's not as possible to get a significant advantage out of the optimal builds. If you're seeing that streamers are capable of generating way better characters than the average person, then it's time for a balance pass, potentially, where you want to try to condense that skill, that difference down and make it as small as possible. So player power should come from more items accessible to everyone, rather than skills or stats that are class dependent, or player skill that is dependent on how long you've played the game. You can make your game more of a stat check than a skill check. And that tends to also reduce the disparity between those who have played your game for thousands of hours and those who have played your game for 10 hours. That said, players who are looking for a skill challenge will run screaming from that game because they don't just want a stat check. They want to be able to show the skill that they have acquired. So as games scale in the number of options that they have, that's difficult to do. Another call out to Path of Exile. Good luck balancing Path of Exile's interactive systems. There are just so many of them that I'm sure that is an NP complete problem at this point. This is outdated now, but when you have 274 active skills that are usable by any character class and 177 support gems that can be used by any character class and just about any skill, and you can have up to 5 supports per skill, suddenly just the sheer number and power of combinations, how do you balance that against each other to ensure that every combination of that for every skill, for every class is equally viable? There's going to be no way. And of course, builds are made up of combinations of 1,325 passive nodes. So 1,325 choose 120 is a very, very large number. So considerations and balance for a game like this. How much damage, raw damage, does your skill do? What is the range? How far away can you do that damage? What is the base speed? How frequently can you reuse that skill? The base crit chance and crit multiplier, so how frequent and how powerful are the crits? Scaling mana cost, how frequently can you cast this before you run out of mana? Scaling damage effectiveness of supports. Each damage type causes different kinds of ailments that can affect things differently. They can slow down monsters, they can cause damage over time, they can cause future hits to deal more damage. The extent to which character investment, any of these affects any of the behavior, so you could add area of effect in your passive tree that will scale the area of effect for all skills that character uses. Or you could scale damage over time, or you could scale whatever aspects you want. Again, just good luck balancing all of these that are multiplicatively related to each other. The space of the game is just too large to have any hope of balancing. Any system that you would come up with to approximate this is going to be so far from the actual truth that there are issues with that attempt at a balance pass. So at that point, you just live with the fact that there's going to be a very large difference between what is optimal and viable and non-viable. And a significant portion of the game is going to be non-viable if you balance it for viable. Let's talk about the concept of god stats and dumb stats. A god stat by the community is just known as one that is overpowered or required for a particular build in order for that build to be optimal. So if in a game you have dexterity scaling bow damage, you're a bow build. Dexterity is your god stat. You cannot make a viable bow character without investing in dexterity. A dumb stat is a stat that is not required at all for a build. So intelligence scales spell damage, and you're a bow build. But that's all intelligence does. A lot of games try to make each stat have some kind of viability for each build, but I'm anticipating this being a very basic game in this sense, where each stat only does 1 or 2 things. And in this case, you're a bow build, you want to scale the thing that does bow damage, not spell damage. So that's just the difference between a god stat and a dumb stat. Yeah.
Like D&D suffers from this.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely does.
Druids, they don't need dexterity. They just don't.
So having god stats and or dump stats in your game creates decisions that aren't meaningful. If I'm a bow build, I have no interest in putting stats in intelligence. I want to dump just about everything into dexterity. It's not an interesting decision. I'm not trading anything off. There's just a right choice and a wrong choice. So from a design perspective, you want elements of a build to be at least marginally interesting. The decisions should be marginally interesting, even if there is an optimal choice. That choice should be bouncing around a little bit. Once you've scaled your dexterity to a certain extent, an extra point in dexterity could be offset by a percentage increase in another stat that doesn't do something quite as useful as damage, But if there's exponential decay on how relevant a particular stat is as you dump more and more into it, then maybe the mana you gain from intelligence starts to become more useful than a little bit of extra damage from dexterity, because that is scaled so much because you have so many points in dexterity. Now it creates an interesting decision where you know bow builds should dump most of their stats into dexterity, but eventually that shifts to the secondary uses of the other stats. So this is something like many CRPGs have strength affecting carrying capacity, and that's relevant to all characters. You can only carry around so much as your strength, and even though it scales melee damage and you're a ranged character or a magic character, there are reasons to dump points into strength now. Strength affecting your ability to move large rocks in order to access treasure rooms. That now becomes viable for all characters, so you can map the stats of the game onto outcomes in the game's world to give you an additional reason to invest in that stat. So items are abundant in the game world. It may not be as important to make all items relevant to all characters, but there should be a place for each designed item in some viable or optimal build. Otherwise, why is it in the game if no one will ever use it? So make sure that as you design items, you think about when is this item the best item to use for some class at some point in time, for some character at some point in time. That should be the goal of every single game object that you put in a game. It has a use. One thing to be wary about. You play a character that seems viable early, becomes less viable over time. You are getting feedback from the game that says the decisions that you made were good. Good job, you're building a very strong character. And then that falls off over time to the point where it doesn't feel like your character is viable anymore. That's something that should be caught in playtesting. But players are making choices blindly, don't understand the game systems enough to make informed decisions, or are making their informed decisions about how easy it is to play this character right now. Maybe your game's design is such that all builds are viable for the first half of the game, and then some builds are viable in the second half of the game. And you are hoping that your player is going to be able to discern that as they play the game. This would be an example that hopefully, again, you catch in playtesting, where you would see that some of your player base is not able to do that. They're not noticing the difference between a good build and a bad build as you move from the first half of the game to the second half of the game. So you would want some extra direction in there in your game to help lead players into making decisions that are going to be viable in the second half of the game. So you can point to a balance problem that you should address, a game communication problem where players don't understand the in-game systems or how to optimize, at least to a level of making a viable build. They can cause a player decision paralysis if they're thrown a bunch of decisions and have to make an informed decision when they have 1,325 passive nodes to choose from, and you don't know how to build that. They're just going to make a decision to avoid the decision paralysis and say, you know what? I'm not having fun sitting here thinking about this. I'm going to make a decision, continue playing the game. And if that type of behavior leads to a non-viable build, then your game has a scaling problem, player decision paralysis problem. So you can reduce the scope of player choice to give the players at each particular decision point, give them fewer options to consider. Even without changing the scale of the game, Path of Exile, I'll continue to use what I'm used to, but this 1,325 node passive tree, the very first decision you make is between 2 nodes. The next decision you make is between 3 nodes. After a while, you're making decisions between 5 nodes or 6 nodes. And after a while, you're making decisions between hundreds of nodes. But it starts out very small and it's scaling, allowing you to build a path through and plan without overwhelming you from the very beginning. Even though there's a ton of content there, it leads you through that and is designed in such a way to not cause decision paralysis until you understand the game's systems more. And I think that is reasonable design. If you're going to have something that is complex, lead the player up to the complex decision making. Don't just throw them off the deep end. And of course, if you attempt to perfectly balance everything, all builds might perform identically, and then players don't feel like their choices have any meaning. So either make it seem like their choices are really important to them and then don't actually have them be that important, but it still seems like it's really important, or make some options better than others, telegraph it better, communicate it better, and balance for that. So check your source code, always check your source code. Games have shipped with stats that don't do anything. I forget, there was one game where luck literally, it told you that it did something, but it didn't do anything. I forget which game it was. But it was just something that wasn't gotten to in the game's code, completely skipped over and was shipped with luck doing absolutely nothing and having no effect on your character. You can increase the effect of your players' decisions. So make those decisions more meaningful, but make all of the options different and viable, but also meaningful. So if you increase the effect of decisions, it could, depending on how you balance things, increase the distance between viable and optimal builds. So as with just about everything in computer science, as just about everything in life, you're balancing benefits and detriments. If you make one design decision, you're prioritizing something over something else. And that eventually you're going to have to be okay with the decisions that your game makes with regards to how players are going to have to play your game. But again, you should recognize that as the designer, and you can communicate that to your player base in some capacity. So yeah, as with everything in computer science, there's always a trade-off. I think I've harped on this point enough. Regardless of your attempts to perfectly balance every system in your game, there will be issues that players can identify. You should be communicating these clearly enough for players to make informed decisions. This makes sense. Question for the class: how can players misinterpret the value of something in a game? Maybe an example of something that you've experienced in a game that you've played.
In Dark Souls 2, there was a stat, I think it was adaptability or something.
Yeah.
And like, I think it might do multiple things, but most players didn't realize for the longest time it actually changes how many iframes you have when you dodge.
Yeah.
And yeah, people were pretty sore about that.
You know, up to your poison resistance and other resistances, but then it had this like weird like 3-letter abbreviation that would go up, and nobody knew what it was until eventually people figured out that it was how big your iPhone was.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, so the game has something in it that you're meant to understand, but then doesn't communicate it well enough for you to understand and allow for that in your decision-making process. Any other examples? A frequent type of this is you see something like strength. Oh, strength increases melee damage in every other game that I've played. So without looking at the game's in-game health, I'm going to assume that if I scale my strength, I'm going to be scaling my melee damage. So you may make an assumption based on your experience with that other game. So, quote, like, what do you mean my rogue needs wisdom? The UI could just fail to provide enough or relevant information about something, burying it in a help menu somewhere. It's not clear from a tutorial. It's not descriptive enough that it's something that you can easily see. So you gain 5 stat points on level up, but it's not clear how these stats affect other game systems. You can pour points into these 5 named stats. What do they do? Who knows? The UI can also overwhelm you with too much information. As an example, I have WoW. What's happening here?
Yeah, I was
If
gonna.
you haven't played WoW like me, I was like, wow, no thanks. But if you have, this is probably reasonably familiar to you. But how much experience do you need with a game to know what's going on the screen right now? It's a lot. It's a lot.
10,000 hours.
So you can always scale how much information the UI is providing you, but humans have a limit as to what they can pay attention to or need significant amounts of training to be able to perform when they're given this much information. You need to be able to filter to the relevant information. Where is my character? What am I doing? What in this UI is relevant to what I'm doing right now? There's a lot of design here that could probably be filtered to the relevant information, or at least allow the user to do so to avoid screen clutter like this.
Are those
One,
buffs?
two. Are those what?
Those buffs in the top right?
I have no clue. I pulled this off the internet.
Yeah.
I really hope this isn't what I was gonna say, but I really hope this is like one of those like meme images where it's like here's just a bunch here's like Star Wars, except here's a bunch of UI from like Nintendo games. But I was about to say, I was gonna say something where it's like, you know, I was gonna jokingly say like Suicide Squad killed the Justice League, where it's like, man, it's not as bad as this. Like, oh my god, what's going on here? But like, I just remember, like, man, there's a lot of stuff happening, and I just remember hearing, like, man, there's a lot of redundancies. Like, why do you need a label that says your shield is low when the screen is blue? Like, the screen is blue and full of hexagons. I think that means the shield is low. You don't need to tell me twice.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the memes of like Elden Ring if Ubisoft had designed it, and there's like all these quest markers and quest logs and things, and just totally cluttered up. And then there's like an NPC saying, "Hey, you should go some vision."
You know, it reminds me of those like Japanese websites from the 2000s, where it's just like everything is filled with stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's too much. It's confusing.
One of the biggest pet peeves I have ever is when you open up a world map and it's nothing but icons. Frustrates me so bad. It's like this.
Yep. All right. We have one more slide deck to cover. On combat. Because I think this is a really important concept in games. Lots of games have combat, and making sure that your combat is fun, engaging, interesting. There's a lot that goes on in the design of that. So we should have a discussion about how to design for engaging combat. So, question for the class. Probably the last thing we'll do. Think about, in one sentence, describe the best combat experience you had in a video game.
Viewing so
Yeah.
I think honestly in Super Metroid, the first Torzo fight or the statue from Spike,
Yeah.
I think because they were able to get the balance down really well, so that it almost always works out that you're almost at a health kill Torzo, because you only have like one energy tank and one or two missile tanks at that once. They were able to really tune it really well.
That was a long run-on sentence, but yeah,
No,
it was technically one sentence.
yeah.
No, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Any others?
It's definitely not combat like the traditional sense, but in sim racing games, like when you're in a battle, you really like get into a flow state and
Yeah.
you don't like you really feel like you're there because you're so focused on the battle itself that you're not like thinking about the fact that you're sitting in a chair in your house.
Yeah. I think mine would be one click to obliterate an entire screen, recognizing hundreds of hours of preparation, planning, and optimized decision making. I'm a very different player from most of them. I don't need difficulty. I want long-term planning and payoffs.
I'd say threading the needle, timing your dodges perfectly through massive explosions and lasers coming from the mouth of a dragon.
Ooh, I like that. So there's a lot there. Anyone else? Bunch of Stardew Valley players in here.
Honestly, I was gonna joke. I placed a monkey down. They popped the balloon.
That's interesting. It's very, very different, but I like it. I like it. So yeah. My follow-up question is how many people mentioned spreadsheet, algorithm, or math in their response? Pretty close, but again, I'm the weird one here. So when it comes time to combat, designers will use spreadsheets, algorithms, and math, but the end result is you're not having your users, your players engaging with that. It should feel fluid. It should feel active. So designing for that, using one system to create another system is interesting. We'll explore that in more detail starting tomorrow. We'll get through it over the next couple of days, and we can spend some time getting card game data next week.
Okay.